As many of you know, this is Black History Month, and I've decided finally to go and present a little bit on one of our Black Canadian aviators, Junius Lyman Edward Hokan. He's one of about 60 Blacks that I've identified who served in the RCAF during the Second World War. Now, Black Canadians in the RCAF, finding information on them is difficult, as the RCAF did not track who was a member of a visible minority group. There are no records that say, here's the Chinese Canadians, the Japanese Canadians, the Black Canadians, Indigenous Canadians. Secondly, when you look at the records, the personnel files, Black Canadians at the time had names that were very similar to those of white Canadians, unlike Chinese and Japanese whose names and surnames, even when sometimes anglicized, give away their ethnic origin. So you can't identify these people by their name. Now, the question is, I say who, that Junius was first. I state that in my title, that he was the first Black Canadian fighter pilot in the RCAF. Now, with all the work that I've done, he's the first that I have found. Now, that's not to say that there may not be somebody else who enlisted earlier who I've not yet found and who became a fighter pilot, but the chances of not having been found yet are slim, but I wouldn't say impossible. So for now, I believe Hokan was the first Black Canadian fighter pilot, but not the first Black Canadian to serve in the RCAF. There's many others before him in both the regular force and the RCAF auxiliary. Now, in this presentation, I plan on providing some background on barriers that Black Canadians face, then some background on Hokan himself, and I'd also like to look at what he actually did. After all, when we talk about fighter pilots, it's all about what they achieved. Now, Hokan was born on the 4th of March, 1922 in St. Catharines, Ontario, to Ella Bollen and Cowrie Lyman Hogan. And that's Hogan, H-O-G-A-N. His mother was Black and his father was Hawaiian. In this photo here, Ella is at the bottom right. Now, his father was a veteran of the First World War, having served in the Canadian Field Artillery. Now, we have to consider that because given that the artillery was a prestigious arm of the militia, the fact that he was able to enlist demonstrated that at least some personnel in the CEF at the higher level were not racist when it came to enlistment. Now, by the time we get to the start of the Second World War, the RCAF had regulations in place for most of its enlistment components that were designed to prevent the enlistment of Asians and Blacks. The phrase that was used was European descent. As you can see in this table, first it was as officers and then as airmen in the auxiliary, where the prohibition started. And then with the war, new members of the Special Reserve were also so treated. Now, why there was no prohibition for airmen wanting to enlist in the regular force, I cannot say and have yet to find. Now, these regulations were promulgated through an order in council, which meant that the cabinet approved these. Why they were prepared, I haven't been able to find, but believe this to be a case of the RCAF emulating the Royal Air Force, as the Royal Air Force had such regulations since the organization was formed. And in fact, if you look back at the Royal Naval Air Service, the Royal Naval Air Service and the Royal Flying Corps, they had prohibitions against visible minorities becoming pilots. Now, that there were 13 Canadians, Black Canadians, I should say, who were enlisted with these regulations in place suggests that there were RCAF recruiting officers who paid no attention to the regulations. Now, this was at two levels. There was the officer at the recruiting center who allowed the candidate to apply. And then there was the officer at RCAF headquarters who approved the acceptance of the candidate. And having looked at a lot of these purse files, it was quite clear in the attestation papers that it stated this person was Black, but there was a positive recommendation to enlist them. Now, when Hokan went to the RCAF recruiting center in Niagara Falls, he listed a number of skills that would have been of interest to the RCAF. On graduating high school, he served as a draftsman. He had taken flying instruction and had taken a course in aerodynamics and navigation. Now, the latter, he had taken through night courses at the St. Catherine's Collegiate Institute and Vocational School, which is also where he went to high school. Now, on his attestation papers, Hokan, his complexion is listed as dark. Now, this is one of the ways of saying Black in the First World War. Of course, not all candidates listed as dark were Black, but many were during the First World War. Now, although this picture seems to show him as being more light-skinned, it's important to note that in Canada at the time, even the government considered that if you had a Black parent, you were considered Black. The color of your skin, whether it was light or dark, didn't matter. The one thing with this photograph is it's a colorized one. And normally the photos of that period were black and white. So maybe when somebody was processing this, they actually lightened it up a bit. Now, when it says dark on the attestation papers, this would not have been enough to trigger any question from the RCAF headquarters. But the fact that the recruiting officer stated, fine type of lad, if no objection to his ancestry, should have raised some flags. It didn't. Hokan was accepted as a pilot / observer candidate on the 11th of November, 1940. Now, the question is, why did the recruiting officer recommend him? Now, that's hard to say as we don't know much about flying officer Oman Wood Froome. He was a veteran of the First World War from Canada. He served in the RAF, enlisting on 30 March 1918. After the war, he lived in the Hamilton area and was fairly well known in the veterans community. He enlisted as an administrative officer on 30 May 1940, which was quite common as an administrative officer for First World War veterans. And Niagara Falls was his first recruiting center after completing his admin course at Trenton. Now, given his future postings, for instance, North Bay was the next one where he was the commanding officer there, and later service, we can speculate that he supported anyone with an enthusiasm for the Air Force. Now, was he aware of the regulations? Considering that he had just come out of the course in Trenton, I would believe that he was. So Hokan's first posting was number 1 Manning Depot in Toronto, of course, basic training. When the course was completed on the 22nd of December 1940, he was sent to the technical training school at St. Thomas. Now, this wasn't because of any need for training, but because the training system had more people going through it than the system could handle. We don't know what Hokan did at St. Thomas, but if it was like any other aircrew candidate of the time, it was probably general duties, cleaning up, being a gopher for this and that, and most likely also security guard duties. Now, on the 20th of February, so 2 months later, he reported to number 1 initial training school for his RCAF specific training. Now, the ITS, of course, taught armaments, engines, meteorology, navigation, the theory of flight. But more importantly, all students went through the linked trainer, where they were assessed on their potential to be a pilot. And here we have to remember that Hokan had already taken some pilot training. During the ITS phase, he was assessed as an above average student. His report also shows that he had considerable interest in aero engineering, and that will show up a little later. After this, he went to number 9 Elementary Flying Training School on the 29th of March, 1941. And here he learned to fly in the Fleet Finch. He was described again as an above average pilot. Then it was off to number 2 SFTS in Ottawa on the 27th of May. Again, high average in terms of flying. The chief ground instructor even noted that Hokan knew more than the marks indicate, and that he anticipated well, even sometimes before his instructor. He was also noted as being very clever. Of interest, this report was signed by W.A. Curtis, commanding officer of 2 SFTS and future chief of the air staff. And Hokan, being one of the top pilots on the course, was commissioned on the 8th of August, 1941. He went to Dieppe 2 days later, or he was posted there, but was actually given 2 weeks embarkation leave before he departed for the UK on the 24th of August. So all of this is absolutely on time. There are no delays here. He's going through the system exactly as he's supposed to. Now, he arrived in the UK on the 2nd of September, and as with all arriving airmen and airwomen, later, he was posted to number 3 Personnel Reception Center in Bournemouth. From there, he went to number 56 OTU on the 16th of September, so 2 weeks. Again, that's for that time, that's pretty standard. Now, he only went from 56 OTU to number 610 Squadron on the 18th of February, 42. So there's actually here quite a lengthy delay. This is longer than normal, but that was because he was hospitalized for having left front sinusitis. So in other words, as he went up in the air, he was having problems with his sinuses. It doesn't say how he was cured, but obviously he was, because he did end up then going to 610 Squadron. And it was very cosmopolitan. He wasn't the only Canadian there, and there were also members of other nations, including Australia, Belgium, France, New Zealand, Norway, and Rhodesia. Now, his first sortie was on the 12th of March. Pretty well, again, standard, because you had to go and become familiar with the layout of the area, learn all of the regulations. He followed with another on the 16th of March. In both of these, he flew as a wingman. But on the 29th of March, he flew as the lead of a 2-man yellow section or yellow flight element. Now, looking at his sorties, in April, he flew 16. Most of these were convoy patrols because that was what 610 Squadron was doing. They were covering British convoys moving along the coast. But there were also shipping recce's to see if there were was any German shipping along the French coast. And there were also 2 scrambles against suspected Luftwaffe aircraft and 1 escort of an air-sea rescue Lysander. Now, while on dawn patrol off Yarmouth on the 27th and flying at 1,000 feet, he saw an aircraft that he believed originally was a bullfighter. Going to investigate, he saw that it dropped its bombs and headed south. It was Junkers Ju-88. He and his wingman attacked, shooting it down. And this made the news in Canada. In May, Hokan flew 20 sorties, flying 2 sorties in a day on 2 occasions and 3 on another. These again were mostly patrols over convoys, but there were also 2 dust patrols. He also began to fly as the section leader or the element leader with greater frequency. So on the 15th of May, while on a scramble, he shared in shooting down the Dornier at CO-217 with 3 others. The Dornier was flying, or spotted flying at about 100 feet off the east coast, and was then attacked. Hokan again got his name put into the news in Canada. Now, June was far busier with 31 sorties. The squadron was also moving away from conducting patrols and flew more escort missions for bombers or on fighter sweeps. Now, Hokan flew in 6 of these. There were also 7 scrambles after reports of Luftwaffe aircraft, flying as the lead in 2-man elements in 3 of these scrambles, and as wingman to Squadron Leader Haywood, DFC, on 1 of these. Interestingly, on the 27th and 28th of June, and then again on the 1st and 8th of August, Hokan flew as wingman to Squadron Leader Haywood on 1 morning and 3 evening patrols. And I say this is interesting because this is far more than Haywood flew with any of the other pilots in the May, June, July timeframe. My best guess would say that he was assessing Hokan to be a flight commander. Now, July was a quiet month for Hokan. He only had 9 sorties. 3 were scrambles, 1 was a convoy patrol, and the rest were either dawn, dusk, or sometimes afternoon patrols. Why he flew that many, or that few, I should say, the records don't say, his personnel records or the squadron records. It's also worth noting that on the 23rd of July, squadron leader Johnny Johnson did his first patrol with the squadron, taking over from Haywood. Then we get to August. In August, Hokan flew 13 sorties, 4 of them in 1 day. The big event that month was Operation Jubilee, also known as the Dieppe raid, in which the squadron moved to West Malling and actually received extra aircraft so that they could make up for any losses or any that were damaged. Obviously, casualties were expected. For the landing at Dieppe, the squadron actually had 4 missions that day. The first was over Dieppe, and the last 3 were to protect the ships as they returned to England. The first one took off at 7:20, and the last landed at 19:05. So even though they were in the fighting only on the first mission, it was actually a very long day. Flying Officer Hokan, as he was then because he was promoted on the 8th of August, flew in all 4 missions. In the first, he flew as an element leader supporting Squadron Leader Johnson, so he was in the same flight as Johnson. The squadron flew top cover at 10,000 feet, but on approaching Dieppe, they could see that there was an aerial combat underway, so they joined in. Hokan attacked a Focke-Wulf FW-190 from the port quarter, getting in a burst of several seconds. In turn, he stopped when a second Focke-Wulf 190 attacked him. He had such extensive damage to the tail of his aircraft that the squadron diarist wondered how it was that he had even made it back. So for the 3 remaining missions that day, Hokan used one particular Spitfire without getting any further scratches on it. So on August 24th, Hokan was posted to 401 Squadron. He had flown 92 sorties with 610 Squadron, and most of them were between an hour and an hour and a half. He had a total of about 112 hours of flying before being posted to 401. In terms of being a leader, we see that he's increasingly serving as an element leader, slowly in May, June a little more, July and August more frequently. In June, he led 13 patrols of scrambles. On 6 sorties, he was part of a larger element or group, so that we don't know if he was an element leader or a wingman. On 3 scrambles, as I said, he was wingman to squadron leader Haywood. So of course, I mean, he was going to be wingman. Haywood wasn't going to allow him to lead. On almost all the sorties where he was the element leader, it was only a 2 aircraft patrol or scramble. Now, as such, he would have been responsible for the tactics as well as safety, looking out for the Hun and the sun, and watching for any enemy aircraft, or actually any aircraft that they might encounter. He would also have been responsible for identification of any aircraft seen. Unfortunately, he didn't encounter the Luftwaffe very often, but then neither did the squadron, especially as many of their sorties were patrols. So we can't say how effective he was as a fighter pilot in that sense, except that he performed well in the attacks that he did conduct. Now, a spherent is a device similar to a sextant that should allow a user to determine the position of the aircraft without having to make use of complex geometrical calculations to incorporate altitude. There had been several designs, but none have been very successful. Now, a functioning spherent would allow navigators, and especially in bomber aircraft, to be able to more quickly and accurately determine their position. So this would have been of particular interest to Bomber Command. Now, we don't know for how long, but certainly while at 610 Squadron, Hokan was working on the design for a spherent in his spare time. He had sent the design itself. We don't know if it's a blueprint or if it's just a rough drawing, but it was sent to the British Air Ministry, who were, to say the least, very interested and wanted him to help develop the design further. Unfortunately, this was not possible because first he was sent to 401 Squadron while the paperwork was being done. Now, at 401 Squadron, they were operating Spitfire Mark 9, and it was commanded by Squadron Leader Keith Hodgson. He only had 6 non-operational flights, and all of them were practice of one form or another. He had 5 operational sorties. 1 was a search and rescue flight, 1 was a patrol over Manston, and 3 were cover for bombers either going to or coming back from France. Regarding the gap that we see here between the 10th and the 23rd, Hokan was actually on beam approach training. Now, then we get to the Morlaix Disaster. This happened on the 26th of September 1942. 3 squadrons were involved. They were to provide cover for 36 US AAF B-17s sent to bomb the airfield at Morlaix on the Brest Peninsula in France. Now, there was 64, 133, and 401 Squadron, and they all took off from Bolt Head, having flown there first. With 401, it was 12 aircraft, and it included the station commander. They were briefed that the wind would be 35 miles per hour from the north. In fact, it turned out to be 100 miles per hour, which meant that all their position calculations were out of whack. And because of the wind and clouds, they had trouble identifying where they were, and they had the additional problem that their fuel supplies were going to be very, very tight. 64 Squadron was able to make it back to England running on fumes, and 1 aircraft even crashed on landing because it ran out. 133 Squadron thought they were over England, went low, and ended up in a fight with Luftwaffe fighters. they lost 11 of 12 aircraft. The survivor had actually turned back early due to engine problems. Now here you can see Bolt Head to the east of Plymouth and Morlaix to the east of Brest. Both are represented by the small red dots. Hodgson realized that the squadron was not over England and continued north. Most of the pilots thought that they would have to bail out given the fuel situation. Now, 40 miles from the English coast, Hokan radioed out of petrol, bailing out. So long, boys, we'll see you tomorrow. Now, the reason for the fuel shortage was that he had used the auxiliary tanks on the way down and was unable to fill up as there were no fueling facilities at Bolt Head. The rest of the squadron just made it to England, some landing with only fumes in their tank, and one of the Spitfires crashed. Squadron leader Hodgson wanted to go out and search for Hokan, but was ordered not to do so because of the wind. Hokan was officially declared missing on the 6th of November, that he was presumed dead on 15th of June, 43. The letter to his mother, squadron leader Hodgson noted that Hokan had fit into the squadron life quite easily. He also noted that Hokan was working on a Spirant, although it appears that Hodgson himself didn't know that he was doing so. So overall, if we look at Hokan, his enlistment was not an oddity at the time that it occurred. That, and at least a dozen others, showed that there were RCAF officers who were willing to turn a blind eye to the regulations prohibiting Asians and blacks from enlisting. Now, once he was in the service, it appears that there were no problems. It was a person's abilities that were more important. And from my own research on blacks and Asians in the RCAF, it seems that getting in was the hard part. Once you were in, again, it was a person's abilities that were the important part. Now, in my opinion, where Hokan shone was with his mind. The reports all observed he had a keen mind, and he was also developing the Spirant, which the Air Ministry, as I said, showed a great deal of interest in. Hokan's ability as a fighter pilot, we can't really assess that. I mean, as a student, he was a very good pilot, above average, and as a potential leader, he did have that. It's just that as a fighter pilot, he never had the opportunities to demonstrate just how good he was. I mean, and that was the result of the squadron itself and all the patrols over the convoys that they conducted. You know, after all, he had only 3 attacks and looked up at aircraft. So again, his capabilities are hard to assess. Few of these actually gave an opportunity to attack enemy aircraft. I think the last word on Hokan's abilities as a fighter pilot belongs to Johnny Johnson, who in a confidential report when Hokan was posted stated, "A keen and reliable leader who with more experience will make an excellent flight commander." And that concludes the presentation.